Hi, everyone. It is 4 o'clock in the East. I'm Alicia Menendez in for Nicole Wallace. As we come on the air, we are tracking a fascinating split screen. On the one hand, the disgrace, twice impeached, twice indicted, legally liable for sexual assault ex-president raging on Truth Social and whining about the possibility of more indictments during his town hall with Sean Hannity. On the other, special counsel Jack Smith, who by all accounts is calmly carrying on, with each passing hour moving closer to potentially indicting Donald Trump again, this time over efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Just today, Jack Smith was spotted at a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., where a federal grand jury was meeting. And although Trump has no plans to travel to Washington this week to testify before the special counsel, William Russell, a former White House aide of Trump's who works for his 2024 presidential campaign, will testify to the grand jury tomorrow. And now, as Donald Trump squirms and sweats, waiting for the special counsel's next move, we are getting new insight into what Jack Smith might have up his sleeve. NBC News has now confirmed that the target letter Donald Trump received from Jack Smith informing him that he is a target of the federal investigation into efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election spells out in black and white 3 federal statutes related to the deprivation of rights, conspiracy to defraud the U.S., and tampering with a witness. And those federal statutes are not for the faint of heart. As the New York Times reports, the possibilities are chilling. Conspiring to defraud the U.S., for example, is, quote, a crime punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Then there's a conspiracy to submit false electors to Congress, which makes false statements a crime punishable by up to 5 years in prison. There have also been, quote, signs that prosecutors have explored potential charges involving wire or mail fraud related to Mr. Trump's fundraising efforts in the name of overturning the election results. It's worth noting that wire fraud could be punishable by 20 years in prison. And that, quote, subpoenas issued by Mr. Smith suggest that he has been scrutinizing Mr. Trump's political action committee, Save America PAC. It raised as much as $250 million, telling donors the money was needed to fight election fraud, even as Mr. Trump had been told repeatedly that there was no evidence to back up those claims. Now, we don't know yet how this is all going to turn out, whether Trump will be indicted again, when it will happen, or exactly what the charges will be. But for now, hour by hour, the plot thickens. Joining us now to break this all down, New York Times Washington correspondent Charlie Savage, whose byline is on that reporting I just read from. Also with us, former U.S. Attorney and MSNBC legal analyst Barbara McQuaid, and former Congressman from Florida, now an MSNBC contributor, David Jolly. Charlie, I want to start with you. Walk us through these 3 federal statutes that are specifically cited in the target letter Donald Trump received: deprivation of rights, conspiracy to defraud the U.S., and tampering with a witness.
Sure. Well, 2 of those are statutes that everyone has been talking about for a long time: conspiracy to defraud the U.S. And the one that you're calling tampering with a witness, I think, is a reference to Title 18, Section 1512. And even though the title of that is tampering with a witness, that's not the provision that we think is going to be used here. It's not going to be about tampering with a witness. It's going to be Section C, which is obstruction of an official proceeding. That's a charge that's been used against many of the January 6 rioters. They were obstructing Congress's proceeding to count the Electoral College votes. So we've known about those 2. That's been discussed. That was in the January 6th committee's criminal referral to the Justice Department, and that's not a surprise. The one that's out of left field is this civil rights statute that apparently is in the letter as one of the things this grand jury in D.C. has been looking at: deprivation of rights. And I've talked to a lot of people today, and we're all just sort of scratching our heads about what the theory of the case Jack Smith is working with there. Is it, whose rights are being? It's a statute goes back to the post-Civil War period, where black people were being prevented from voting by sort of early Ku Klux Klan white supremacist stuff, and the feds were coming in to stop them from preventing those people from exercising their constitutional rights. How does that apply to this situation is mysterious, and people are wrapping their heads around or trying to, scenarios like, well, is it Mike Pence as the guy presiding over the hearing, or Congress that had some kind of constitutional privilege that was interfered with? We don't know. That's the part that has the people whose noses are up against the glass really puzzled at this point.
Barb, do you have a theory of why that statute is in play?
I really don't. It's surprising to me. As Charlie said, the first two are two that have been discussed quite frequently. This third one, not so much. But if anybody's rights have been violated here, it would seem to me perhaps it is the electorate. So maybe it is the voters of the states where there was an effort to overturn their votes and get state legislatures to reconvene and cast their own slates. That could be a conspiracy to deprive voters of their right to cast their vote and have it counted the way they cast it. But it's really pure speculation on my part, and I'll be really curious to read this theory. And of course, they may have evidence that we don't know about that has not been in the public domain yet, which is why nobody has speculated on that third charge.
And Charlie, you also say there are signs that wire fraud could be in play with regard to Trump's PAC and his fundraising, or the big lie, or as the January 6th committee put it, the big ripoff.
Yeah, so I mean, that reporting was before these three statutes sort of leaked out as what was written on the letter, and wire fraud is not one of them. Of course, there could always be a superseding indictment that would bring this into play, so it doesn't mean that it never will be. But we do know that earlier in Jack Smith's investigation, they were issuing subpoenas and questioning witnesses about the fundraising by Trump's PAC. They were, raised over $250 million from Trump supporters, from donors that were told this is going to go to a legal defense fund that's going to fight election fraud. And not only, of course, had Trump been told there was no election fraud, but they spent the money on other things. There was no legal defense fund, and the money went to things like, $200,000 to Trump's hotel properties and things like that. And so it sure looks like Jack Smith was exploring mail and wire fraud for soliciting money to be transferred across state lines fraudulently. But if that's not one of the statutes that's listed in this targeting letter, maybe he decided that was just too complicated to bring, or maybe he's holding it back for a superseding indictment. Who knows?
David Jolly, we always talk about which of these pieces might finally break through politically with Trump's base. And you have to ask if the possibility of his having defrauded his own donors might be it.
Yeah, I don't think so, Alicia, simply because everything we've seen thus far suggests that that will not be the case. And so, look, as between Donald Trump and his donors appear to be fairly loyal, and Republican voters are still supporting him at a clip of about 56% of the party, a majority of the party. Then you move to what about Republican leaders and Republican elected officials? And again, we are seeing them immediately come to his defense. It would seem as we sit today that there are no further indictment developments that will really cripple Donald Trump electorally. There's a question, should he go on trial and lose his liberty? But that would likely be after the Republican nomination is secured in March. I wrestle more with, what does this mean for a country that next summer may be facing a major primary or a major party nominee who is either under indictment, facing trial, potentially to lose his liberty, but also on the ballot in November? This is a real possible failure point for democracy itself in the United States. The red lights begin to flash when you play out that scenario.
An existential challenge for sure. Barb, I have a lot of questions that made me wish that I would have actually gotten that JD I once thought of pursuing. How does this all work? Is Jack Smith limited by this target letter to stay within the confines of the three statutes that I walked through with Charlie, or could we still see much broader charges?
We could. He's not limited. It's not legally confining, but I would be surprised if in this initial indictment he does go beyond it. The target letter really is a heads up, an alert, and an invitation to say that the grand jury is thinking about indicting you for these charges. Would you like to come in and tell your side of the story? And so to me, if the letter is limited to those three, I would be surprised if there were additional charges in this round. But as Charlie said, what is often the case is the investigation will continue to go on. The grand jury may continue to investigate other crimes or other people, especially once people get charged. Sometimes some of those defendants decide they want to cooperate. And so additional charges could get added in a superseding indictment. On the other hand, there is a case to be made for being focused in your charges. Even if it's possible to charge Trump with some sort of financial fraud crimes, the really big crime here is the conspiracy to defraud the United States, an effort to overturn the election. And I think sometimes prosecutors worry about throwing too much into a case. the kitchen sink. And so by keeping it focused on one scheme, it seems like perhaps a better strategy for making sure the jury understands the case, can follow the case, and the trial doesn't last for months and months. It can be streamlined and focused on what's most important.
Well, then let me ask you, what do you make of William Russell, a former White House aide, testifying before the federal grand jury?
Yeah, it sounds like they're continuing to have at it. I'd be surprised if there's a whole lot more testimony to be taken, because once you send that target letter, you would only send that because there's a possibility he says, yes, I would like to come in and testify. And so you would only want to send that when you feel like, I've really had a chance to talk to everybody. I've really had a chance to look at all the documents. I'm as educated as I can be about this case, so that when I get my one shot to question Donald Trump, I am as prepared as I can be. And so you may have some odds and ends here and there, some finishing touches that will continue, but it sounds to me like they're close to the end.
Charlie, your colleagues at the New York Times reported on William Russell being subpoenaed by the special counsel last fall. Russell is, quote, a 31-year-old aide to Mr. Trump who served as a special assistant and the deputy director of presidential advance operations in the White House. He continued to work for Mr. Trump as a personal aide after he left office, one of a small group of officials who did so. A person with knowledge of the FBI's interest in Russell said that it related to the grand jury investigation into events that led to the Capitol attack by Mr. Trump's supporters. Talk me through, Charlie, why Russell is important, what it is that he might know.
Well, Russell's obviously young, but he's someone who's close to Trump in terms of carrying his stuff around and being physically adjacent to him a lot. And so he would be party to, one would think, a witness to a lot of conversations that Trump was having with other people in those crucial months after the election, as he was trying in myriad ways to reverse his loss and block the rise of Joe Biden. And so all I can say is I suspect they want to hear from him about what he saw and heard more than maybe what he personally did. That is also my speculation.
Barb, as far as we know, Donald Trump is the only one to have received this target letter. I want to play something else that gets into the question of who else in his orbit might receive a target letter. Take a listen.
He sat in the White House for hours while the attack was going on the Capitol and did absolutely nothing, despite the fact that many people, myself included, were personally asking him to put out a statement asking people not to be violent. Yet he sat there for hours and did nothing. It's not just me. It's people like Mark Meadows, his own chief of staff at the time, who has said that despite pleas from him, from folks like his daughter Ivanka Trump, his son-in-law Jared Kushner, and others, Kellyanne Conway, all asking him to act and act quickly.
I mean, given that you have all of these people, Barb, who could testify to intent, what does that tell you? I mean, does it tell you that some of them are potentially cooperating? Can you glean anything from the fact that he's the only one who's received a target letter?
Well, he's the only one we know who has received a target letter. It's quite possible that others have as well. And frankly, I'd be surprised if Donald Trump is the only name that shows up on an indictment. I don't want to speculate as to who, but there was a whole crew of people inside the White House. There was someone at the Justice Department. There were people on his campaign who were assisting in this plot. And so I'd be surprised if Donald Trump is the only one. Now, it may be that some people got that target letter and said, yes, I would like to come in and talk with you. For example, Rudy Giuliani, it has been reported in the past couple of weeks, has gone in and spoken under what's known as a proffer letter, which is an agreement not to use against him any statements he says during that meeting. And so it may be that he has agreed to cooperate. And so sometimes that happens when you give that target letter. The person says, oh, my God, don't indict me. I want to be a witness. Let me tell you everything I know, and we can work out some sort of a deal. So sometimes this is the moment of truth when that happens. Sometimes it comes earlier. Sometimes it comes later after a person has been charged and the case proceeds for a while and they realize what they're up against. So I don't know if we can be sure, but I'd be surprised if Donald Trump is the only name listed as a defendant in that indictment.
Charlie, your colleagues at the New York Times were the first to report that Mark Meadows testified before the federal grand jury in the Jack Smith investigation in June, and that was unsettling to Trump and to his team. Quote, for months, people in Mr. Trump's orbit have been puzzled by and wary about the low profile kept by Mr. Meadows in the investigations. As reports surfaced of one witness after another going into the grand jury to be interviewed by federal investigators, Mr. Meadows has kept largely out of sight. And some of Mr. Trump's advisors believe he could be a significant witness in the inquiries. I wonder, Charlie, based on your reporting, the reporting of your colleagues, Team Trump seems to suspect or be worried that Meadows has flipped.
I think that they are worried about him. This has been a strain for a while. Like, where's Mark Meadows? What's happening that it's so quiet in that direction? And obviously, we were talking about this young aide before who's going in now. Mark Meadows really was in the room where it happened as much as anyone other than Trump himself. So he would be a crucial witness if he chose to cooperate with the government. He would have tales to tell. And so, we'll see in a few weeks if this indictment does come, what it says about him. But I think you're putting your finger on one of the most interesting strains here.
Barb, another headline I want to make sure we get to today that we're going to take a deeper look at later in the show. Jack Smith has, quote, requested surveillance and other security footage recorded at Atlanta's State Farm Arena, which, of course, has to do with the false claims of election interference involving Ruby Freeman, Shea Moss claims. We know, thanks to the January 6th testimony of Bill Barr, of others, that Trump knew were false. We also know that Jared Kushner was questioned by Jack Smith's team about whether Trump, quote, privately acknowledged in the days after the 2020 election that he had lost. The line of questioning seems to suggest that prosecutors are trying to establish whether Trump was acting with corrupt intent as he sought to remain in power, essentially that his efforts were knowingly based on a lie. Barb, all signs point to Jack Smith zeroing in on Trump's state of mind. Why is that so key here?
So for the crimes that we're talking about here, you'd have to show an intent to defraud or at least a corrupt intent. And that means he had to know that he lost the election when he was taking all of these steps. And so how do you prove that? Well, if he said out loud, I know I lost the election, but I'm still going to pretend I won, that would be the home run. It's probably unlikely that he actually uttered those words. But the more you can have witnesses come in, William Barr, cyber czar Chris Krebs, his own campaign members, his own polling statisticians, the more you can have people come in and say, we told him he lost, the more you can build that evidence. Jurors get an instruction from a judge along the lines of, because we cannot read another person's mind, it's impossible to know their intent, but we can draw reasonable inferences based on all the things they said and all the things they did. And so all of those things will be what the prosecutors are trying to put together to show that Donald Trump did indeed know that he lost the election. And I'll add one other thing. A jury would also be instructed on a phrase known as willful blindness, which is once there is abundant evidence that a fact is true, you cannot simply turn a blind eye and pretend it's not true. You cannot ignore a high probability that a fact is true.
Willful blindness, indeed. Charlie Savage, Barbara McQuaid, thank you so much for getting us started. Jay Vijali, you are sticking with us. When we come back, top Republicans in the House coming out to defend the ex-president. New reporting this afternoon on his outreach directly to them and what plans they're making to counter these potential charges. Plus, real-life consequences of the big lie for those 16 Trump supporters in Michigan. A closer look at who they are and the very serious charges they're facing for trying to overturn a presidential election. And later in the show, more on the significance of why Jack Smith wants that security footage from a polling site in Atlanta, the reporter who broke that story coming up, and more when Deadline White House continues after this. Don't go anywhere. Everyone has got one. You know it. The nails on a chalkboard song. The why is this always on the radio? How could anyone possibly enjoy this ballad? It is that precise feeling, keeping track of Republicans after Trump's scandal. Through Access Hollywood, Charlottesville, Impeachment 1, Impeachment 2, a deadly attack on our seat of government, not to mention countless other embarrassing instances, the GOP invariably goes about their same old song and dance, squirming, contorting, floundering their way through questions of justice and accountability. We've been through this 1,000 times, so it is any surprise that they're doing it again after Donald Trump got that target letter? Leaving no room for doubt, NBC News is now reporting Trump actually called Speaker Kevin McCarthy and Conference Chair Elise Stefanik yesterday, urging them to work to rally support for him among GOP lawmakers. That is according to two sources familiar with the calls. The result? Well, you know the melody.
Well, I guess under a Biden administration, Biden America, you'd expect this. If you notice recently, President Trump went up in the polls and was actually surpassing President Biden for re-election. So what do they do now? Weaponize government to go after their number one opponent.
We have yet again another example of Joe Biden's weaponized Department of Justice targeting his top political opponent, Donald Trump. There cannot be one set of laws if your last name is Biden and another set of laws for law-abiding Americans.
Let's bring in NBC News senior Capitol Hill correspondent Garrett Haake and Democratic strategist and director of the public policy program at Hunter College, Basil Smikle. David Jolly is still with us. Garrett, you were one of the reporters who got the scoop on the Trump phone calls to top GOP leaders. What do we know about what exactly was said?
Well, Alicia, I wear two hats at this network. I cover Donald Trump and I cover Congress. So I've been in the middle of this kind of thing where sometimes defenses of Trump among Republican lawmakers are organic and sometimes they're directed. And in this case, it was a little bit of both, with lawmakers kind of singing from the same hymnal that they've been using for two indictments now, defending the former president using his language about a weaponized federal government. But in this case, there was also a proactive effort by Donald Trump to reach out and to get ahead of kind of the messaging around what's expected to be a third indictment here, at least if you believe Trump's statement on Truth Social. And today, one of those lawmakers, Elise Stefanik, confirmed our reporting when asked about it by my colleague Kate Santeles on Capitol Hill. Here's what she said.
Have you spoken with former President Trump since he learned that he's the target in Jack Smith's probe on January 6th?
I have spoken with President Trump. I spoke with him yesterday. I speak with President Trump on a weekly basis, give or take. And this is yet another example of the illegal weaponization of the Department of Justice to go after Joe Biden's top political opponent.
Now, that's the lawmaker in charge of messaging on behalf of the House Republican Conference. It's as close to the House Republican Conference sort of moving in that direction with unanimity as you're liable to see here. And, Alicia, it goes with a pattern that we've seen with Donald Trump since he was really first assumed the office in 2017. He expects not just loyalty, but public loyalty from his supporters. It's not enough to believe that he did no wrong. You have to go out and say it on television. And we've seen many lawmakers on the Hill come out and do exactly that, even bringing this up without being prompted to defend the former president. I expect that to continue to be the case well into whatever legal period we're about to enter around this case.
And Garrett, there's still so much we don't know about what Jack Smith has actually collected on classified documents and on January 6th. Mm-hmm. I want to know, based on your reporting, any sense that Stefanik or McCarthy or anyone else in leadership, for that matter, is actually worried about a potential forthcoming indictment?
The short answer is no. I mean, these lawmakers have sort of made their bed when it comes to Donald Trump. They are, in the case of Stefanik, somebody who's publicly endorsed him, all in. Kevin McCarthy hasn't publicly endorsed Donald Trump, but he's done just about everything else. He's directed the House to defend Donald Trump, essentially, in the case of the New York indictment. I mean, these folks are pretty much all in. There's no backing out of this now. I think there are lawmakers who may have more skin in the game in terms of whatever happens from this Jack Smith investigation. Someone like Scott Perry, who was involved in the investigation, had his cell phone seized at one point, may be more concerned about what's coming down the pike here. But at this point, the playbook is well worn. The talking points are well established. And the House GOP and Donald Trump and his other allies are going to kind of hold hands and jump on this one together.
Well, I mean, as Stefanik said there, she talks to him once a week. David Jolly, I want you to take a listen once more to Kevin McCarthy and then what he said in the aftermath of the January 6th attack.
So what do they do now? Weaponize government to go after their number one opponent. It's time and time again. The president bears responsibility for Wednesday's attack on Congress by mob rioters. He should have immediately denounced the mob when he saw what was unfolding. And make no mistake, those who are responsible for Wednesday's chaos will be brought to justice.
David Jolly, I'd ask what happened to Kevin McCarthy, but it seems like a pretty rhetorical question at this point.
It does, Alicia. A shameful and disgusting moment from Kevin McCarthy this week, knowingly misleading, worthy of rebuke, proving to be a speaker who brings dishonor on the House. Just as he condemned Donald Trump after January 6th, his actions and words this week deserve condemnation as well, because he knows that he is being dishonest with the American people. And that condemnation should go to Elise Stefanik as well. And I think the danger that Kevin McCarthy has suggested he's willing to embark upon is this. The House Republicans, as the majority party, has several tools to their disposal. As Garrett said, they have the messaging, the power of messaging, Elisa Stefanik in particular, but we see among the House Republicans the willingness to use this weaponization argument kind of louder and more consistently than any other Republican actor, certainly Republican senators. You also see they're using their tool of oversight authority to wrongly try to bring in Department of Justice investigators and investigate the investigators and create false narratives around this investigation, suggesting it is a Democratic witch hunt. And then the most dangerous tool of all that I think Kevin McCarthy has already promised his caucus is to go after their opponent in Joe Biden and try to create a field to impeach him, though they lack the information and though the law is not on their side. If their guy, Donald Trump, is facing indictment and possible prison time, how do they change the national conversation? They move to impeach a sitting president. That is scurrilous behavior from the Speaker of the House, but also the Republican members who follow him.
Right, they create a false equivalency. Basil, I want to read to you something from NBCnews.com. Our colleagues there, they spoke to a veteran Republican strategist, not aligned with a candidate in this election, who insists in an alternate universe, another prominent GOP candidate like Ron DeSantis risks condemning Trump from the outset. Quote, there is a way of being critical of the FBI, the DOJ, and the Biden administration, and being critical of Donald Trump's actions around January 6th. A candidate that didn't run a full campaign on that, but was sure to be firm and focused that January 6th hurts Donald Trump in the general election would have received benefit from cycles and cycles of news coverage. I guess, Basil, my question is, why did we not see that happen? Why did no one take that calculated risk?
Well, we didn't see anybody take that calculated risk because, as Garrett has said and David has said, they're speaking or singing from the same hymnal. There is retribution that befalls them should they fall out of line. And you have leaders that are more concerned about their political future than of the country's future. And to David's point, the Speaker has the gavel. McCarthy has the gavel of the House of Representatives and is unwilling to at least take a step back and say, you know what? If there is some meat on this bone, we need to take a hard look at what Donald Trump's goal was in January 6th and make sure that it doesn't happen again. But instead of that, they do have the bully pulpit. They do have the opportunity to message and make sure that that message is heard and articulated by every member in the House. And that's really what the problem is here, that whether you are saying that, you know, the Biden administration is weaponizing the Department of Justice, or you're not saying anything at all, your silence is acquiescent. You're basically saying and giving license to the people who tried to overthrow our government and lead this insurrection. And because of that, they're concerned about their own political future. But I also wonder, as Speaker, are you actually protecting your candidates down ballot? You know, if you're running for the U.S. Senate, if you're running for Congress in specific districts, particularly those really tight districts, it's like now in New York that we are able to redistrict and redraw those lines. You know, are you protecting your candidates down ballot? And it seems like they don't even care about that. Their only concern is making sure Donald Trump doesn't get mad at them.
It occurs to me that we keep saying that they're all singing from the same songbook, but that songbook only seems to have one tune. NBC's Garrett Hake, as always, thank you. Basil, David, you are sticking with me. Coming up, Republicans in Michigan are reacting today to those 16 felony charges announced yesterday in the scheme to overturn the election. How they're trying to defend themselves. That story is next. We're getting new details about the group of 16 Republicans who are facing charges for signing paperwork falsely claiming that ex-President Donald Trump had won the state of Michigan in the 2020 election, a state that, as you know, Joe Biden won. The group was part of a broader fake elector scheme aimed to overturn the results of the presidential election by having Trump supporters in 7 battleground states, including Michigan, sign certificates falsely attesting that Trump had won their states. According to Politico, quote, the self-described electors charged, including Kathy Burden, a longtime ally of National GOP Chair Ronna McDaniels, who has publicly cited Burden as being unfairly targeted by the January 6th Select Committee. Burden was at the center of the RNC's bid to define January 6th as legitimate political discourse early last year. They also include Sean Maddock, the former co-chair of the Michigan Republican Party. Maddock told Politico in November 2020 that she was conferring with constitutional lawyers about options would-be Trump electors had despite his loss in the state. We do not yet know the individual dates of each defendant's arraignment. Joining us now, Democratic Congresswoman and Michigan Senate candidate Elissa Slotkin. Congresswoman, does it surprise you that some of these false electors are former members of the mainstream Michigan Republican Party, and in one case has a connection to RNC Chair McDaniel? These are not fringe actors.
No, it doesn't surprise me because we've seen this sort of evolution in Michigan from a Republican Party, sort of your father's Republican Party, to a very, very different thing. And certainly the number 2, the co-chair of the Republican Party, is one of those who's been now brought up on charges. So it doesn't surprise us in Michigan. We've seen that party continue to sort of spiral downward, and we're hoping that they hit bottom and kind of rise back into something else that's reasonable. No, it doesn't surprise me.
I think you'll agree with me that accountability here is in large part about making sure that this never happens again. I want to read you about the charges from Politico. Nessel's office hit the group hard in terms of charges, with each defendant facing 1 count of conspiracy to commit forgery, 2 counts of forgery, 1 count of conspiracy to commit uttering and publishing, 1 count of uttering and publishing, 1 count of conspiracy to commit election law forgery, and 2 counts of election forgery. Each offense in the criminal complaint is a felony, with the maximum punishment ranging from 5 years in prison in some charges to 14 years in others. Weighty charges. Do you think that this will deter future plots of this kind?
Well, see, it's really important to recognize sort of what actually went on the ground, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, a group of people, what they've alleged to have done was create a fake certificate on our election results in Michigan and mail it off to Congress saying, no, this is the correct group or person that won the race in Michigan. Their plan allegedly was to have people in Congress, members of Congress, receive that fake certificate and then use it to object to the certification of the election, as we saw on January 6th. So that was the plan. The good news is we have, in addition to these charges, and I really laud our Attorney General for pushing forward and being sort of first in the nation to do this, but we also quietly passed a piece of legislation in late December that was intended to make sure this never happened again, right? To make sure that there was only one secure certificate that could be sent off from a state, that it had security measures, and that it couldn't be just one rogue congressman or congresswoman who received, and objected to the certification of election. It has to be 20% of the House and the Senate. So we've actually learned since this experience that you can't leave it up to chance and goodwill. You have to put it into law. We did that very quietly at the very end of the year. It didn't get a lot of fanfare, but very, very important for making sure this doesn't happen again.
So given that sort of wild plot that you laid out there, and then some details which you kindly spared us, like a sleepover in the state capitol so they could sneak on to the Senate floor, I want you then to listen to this from the Michigan Republican Party. It's a statement that they released just a short time ago. It says, AG Dana Nessel's recent charge of forgery and conspiracy against 16 alternative electors in Michigan has sparked valid concerns regarding the possible misuse of power by her office. It is crucial to recognize that despite being identified as a liberal, this AG constantly displays authoritarian tendencies and ambitions. Congressman, your response to that?
Well, look, I mean, the charges have been levied. You're innocent until proven guilty. Everyone will get their day in court. And if there was no there, then they will walk. I mean, I think that's the the bottom line is they will have their opportunities. But many of these folks spoke very publicly about wanting an alternative set of results from our election. Many of them were very vocal about trying to get into our Capitol building. So even just stuff you can Google is out there. But they will have their day in court. And if they're accused but didn't do anything wrong, then they should get out, scot-free. It shouldn't be a problem. And I just think, we are a nation of rules and laws. We always have to be a nation of rules and laws. So people have to adhere to that law. And if they don't, they should be held accountable, especially on something as clear and precious as our democracy.
Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin, as always, thank you so much for taking the time. Up next, changing gears for us, a new campaign strategy from President Biden featuring an unlikely foe and why highlighting extremists might be working for him. That story is next. President Joe Biden's re-election team getting help for a recent ad from a pretty surprising source, Marjorie Taylor Greene. A new campaign ad features remarks made by the ultra-right conservative, remarks she thought were an attack on the president. Take a look.
Joe Biden had the largest public investment in social infrastructure and environmental programs that is actually finishing what FDR started, that LBJ expanded on, and Joe Biden is attempting to complete. Programs to address education, medical care, urban problems, rural poverty, transportation, Medicare, Medicaid, labor unions. And he still is working on it.
The president tweeting out the ad with the caption, "I approve this message." Basil Smykel and David Jolly are back with me. David, I didn't have Marjorie Taylor Greene as a Biden campaign surrogate on my bingo card, but we truly are living in the strangest of times. I mean, of course, the choir is going to love this ad. Does it have the possibility of breaking through with folks who, we keep hearing and polling, I'm not happy with either of my options?
Yeah, Alicia, look, I think it does. First and foremost, Joe Biden just keeps getting better with age. Republicans like to keep knocking him, but this guy has his game in shape for going into next November's election. But I think at the core of what that ad does is actually play to Joe Biden's greatest strength in a national election, which is to draw a contrast with Republicans. And Marjorie Taylor Greene drew that contrast for the president. Joe Biden's essential message to the American people is, I want to create ladders of opportunity for all Americans to rise up in education and healthcare and access to jobs and transportation and infrastructure. I want everybody to grow. Marjorie Taylor Greene wants the assault rifle to be the national weapon, and she wants to impeach Hunter Biden even though he's not a government official. That contrast is a fantastic one for Joe Biden. It's a powerful ad, a brilliant ad.
Well, to the point about how powerful it was, Basil, the Biden campaign tells NBC News that the video generated 10 million views in just 3 hours after it was posted. They're using it to drive online fundraising. As of 1 p.m. on Wednesday, it has been viewed 39 million times on all platforms. That is the second most for any Biden campaign video since Inauguration Day. That's behind his re-election announcement video. It would seem to affirm that this is the message. Take this message and run with it.
Well, absolutely. If you're Joe Biden and you have a Republican in Marjorie Taylor Greene comparing you to FDR, who brought the country out of the Depression, and LBJ, who Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Medicare, Medicaid, it's basically a commercial that tells the American people this is what Democrats can do when they're in office. So yeah, we'll take that every day, all day. But here's what's also interesting in terms of the inconsistency and the hypocrisy. Presumably, she did this to sort of marry her position to the Nixon position, which is, look at how bloated your federal government is. Now let's do something different. Sort of the conversation around his Southern strategy and the backlash against what LBJ was doing and working with urban communities to improve. However, just a couple of days ago, there are reports that Donald Trump is trying to find ways to consolidate more power in the executive branch so that when he becomes president, he can run roughshod over agencies and presumably over the other branches of government. So in a very twisted way, this is don't do what we say, do it. I don't know what's the word. It's do as we say and not as we do. Whatever the case is, I'm all mixed up because in no world does this actually make sense. But the reality is that for the Democrats and for Joe Biden, you could not have gotten a better endorsement than Marjorie Taylor Greene in that ad.
Right. I mean, because, David, part of what you realize when you strip away sort of her usual Mad Libs is that what she's saying, sort of core argument from these faux populists, is I don't believe that the government can be an engine for good. And then you have Joe Biden saying, well, actually, it can, and saying it not only in word but in deed, because it's not just that he's using her to VO this ad. He's going to her district to talk about economic investments that have been made in places that are deep, deep red.
Yeah, look, Alicia, most Americans realize today that we are coming off a global pandemic that nearly crippled the economy. We're dealing with inflation, and people are insecure about their own personal earnings and the future of the economy for their kids. And what Joe Biden has done since the day he arrived is said, I will help make it better for you. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is trying to make fun of the president for doing that. So if that's her course, if that's her message, great. What Joe Biden is saying is give the gentlelady from Georgia the biggest microphone we can give her, because the more she talks about my success as president, helping all Americans, the better likelihood that Joe Biden is reelected next November.
And a big microphone is all she has truly ever wanted. Basil Smikle, David Jolly, as always, thank you both. We're going to take a quick break. 2 new losses for the ex-president from 2 separate judges in New York. Those headlines coming right up.